לכל מי... זה יותר טוב? תודה. עכשיו אני וגם ג'ים רוץ', שהוא היה ראש חיל האוויר בארצות הברית, ונדבר באנגלית. אז כל מי שצריך אוזניות לתרגום בעברית יש בחוץ. So first of all, thank you for joining us today. I'm Avi Schnurr. I am the Executive Director of IMDA. It is a particular pleasure to be here, representing the Israel Missile Defense Association. And I wanted to thank, in particular, Dory Gold, his entire staff at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and of course my Associate Director, Michael Oppenheim, who thinks nothing of calling me at midnight with a new idea or a new issue to discuss. And I have to say, I sometimes return the favor. Since the war last summer, as many people have spoken this morning, there has been a fundamental change in Israel's strategic reality. One way or the other, the response will mean making progress on the path toward comprehensive missile defense. This is a path that the State of Israel has already begun. It's clear there are several very important programs that have started. Of course, we all know about Chetz. We know about Kippat Barzel, Kela David. This is a path on which we must continue, and to continue effectively on this path will require a broad, informed national discussion and consensus. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take that kind of discussion, a broad national dialogue, in order to make the kind of progress that we're going to need to face the kinds of issues that the speakers this morning have been discussing. We have begun the task. We have not yet finished. Today, at this conference, this is an event, a very important event, which I think can help move this dialogue along, can help begin the process of increasing the informed discussion in the public, in the media, within the government of this subject. I first met Secretary Jim Roach in his hometown, which at the time was not well known. It's a small place on the eastern seaboard in the United States called Annapolis. I doubt that there's anyone in this room today who hasn't heard of it, but when I met Jim, I think it was relatively unknown. We met over breakfast, and as you might guess, we spent the entire morning discussing missile defense policy. So I'd like to set the stage for Jim. I think the key to any effective discussion, any effective policy really related to missile defense, is to look at four fundamental requirements. First of all, it's critical that there be clear goals. Second, we must understand the threats that we're facing. Third, the available defenses, the responses must be quite well understood. And finally, taking all of these together, we must develop option-based scenarios, understanding the threats, understanding the available defenses, what can be done, what are the appropriate mixes, different options, and finally, how can those option-based scenarios be applied to our own, Israel's particular geopolitical reality? Geographic, demographic, our vulnerabilities, our strengths. Out of that process then come results, options, possibilities which can be compared to our goals to see in the end how well different approaches do against the mix of threats with different potential defenses. And we talk about defenses here, as some of the speakers this morning mentioned, we're talking about everything including the active missile defenses as well as passive defenses as well as attack operations. Comprehensive missile defense means all of the above. And finally, it's not enough to do this in a static case. The problems we face are dynamic. They're evolving. We have to look at the evolving threat. We have to project the evolving threat, the evolving defenses, and we also have to look at evolution in our geopolitical reality. What does this mean in practice? Just a couple of examples. If the threat appears to be moving, if we can project ahead and see that the threat perhaps will be moving in the direction of cruise missiles, we need to take that into account in our plans. When geopolitical decisions are made, the missile defense reality must be considered as part of those decisions. If we would expect our strategic depth to shrink in some area, that of course needs to change our perception and our expectations for how to handle missile defense in that zone. If we would decide to create a buffer zone in some regions, that might reduce our need for short-range missile defense. When decisions are considered for redrawing boundaries or dividing a city, we might find ourselves in a situation where neighborhoods and offices are suddenly within mortar range. Again, missile defense needs to be considered with such decisions. The need for missile defense and the type of defense depend on all of these factors: the threats, the responses available, the strategic and political reality as it is likely to change, as all of these different factors are likely to evolve. So Jim will discuss his perspective on some of these factors, and I have to say Jim is not just an armchair policy analyst. With his background as head of the U.S. Air Force, he was forced to translate his policies into actions on a daily basis, and then to live with the consequences, which I imagine is sometimes even harder. Jim Roach was the 20th Secretary of the U.S. Air Force. He served for 4 years, following 23 years in the U.S. Navy. He achieved the rank of captain in the Navy, served as commander of the USS Buchanan. He had a number of policy positions, including work in the State Department's policy planning staff. He was the senior staff member for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the assistant director for the Defense Department's Office of Net Assessment. He was also the Democratic staff director of the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee. And Secretary Roach served as a member of the Secretary of Defense's Policy Board and was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the International Institute of Strategic Studies. He has a very long list of awards. I won't go into them or he'd have no time left to speak. It is my pleasure and my privilege to introduce my friend, Dr. James G. Roach.
Well, you can imagine, as a resident of Annapolis, Maryland, our little boating village, the thought of having an invasion of security people for a major Middle East conference is a little daunting, but I will personally thank Condi Rice for waiting until boating season was over so that we don't interfere with the really important aspect of the Chesapeake Bay. It's a pleasure to be here. Avi Schnurr and I are new friends, but I think became good friends very closely. And in typical fashion, he found me via some of the staff of Governor Wilson of California. And they called me and said, would you please meet with this person? And I said, well, if you ask me to, yes, I will. Although my general sense is to attempt to retire properly, like many other former military officers in this room. I, too, am failing retirement. And my wife makes that very clear to me. Over 20 years ago, Ze'ev Schiff and I gave a presentation in a paper in Jerusalem on this subject. Probably 22 years ago, either 1985 or 1986. And Ze'ev was a wonderful man, and I dearly miss him. Not only was he a wonderful journalist, he was a friend, and he was a wonderful instructor to me. We started out by saying, well, what is the reason why an American and Israeli would want to discuss this together? And certainly the notion of intercontinental ballistic missiles that the Americans face from the Soviet Union, the whole basis of SDIO, is very different than the Israeli context. However, the safety of deployed American forces is very similar. The range of the systems that are being used are shorter range. They don't go exoatmospheric. It's a different kind of a problem. So it's interesting for me to bring up some of the issues we brought up 22 years ago. We made some predictions. Now, our crystal ball was not particularly good, but on the other hand, it was better or the same as anyone else's. And we said that there was a reason why we thought Israel should be concerned about this, and I made the case why I thought America should be concerned as well. And it was that in the case of Israel, it became very clear to its enemies that a land invasion simply was not going to work by virtue of the competencies of the Israel Defense Forces, the Israel Air Force. It also became very clear that none of the potential enemies could really do significant damage to Israel via airplanes because of the competence of the Israeli Air Force. Therefore, in many respects, the doing things well drive an opponent to keep looking for something that's asymmetric. And one of the best asymmetric things for an emerging power are missiles. But I would argue it's both cruise missiles as well as ballistic missiles, and we'll touch on that. So we made the point that this is something that it was almost inevitable. It was going to happen, but that Israel had time, and the Americans had less time at sea, where we had a major cruise missile problem. But generally, we had a major intercontinental ballistic missile problem, but we didn't foresee having a very significant IRBM problem, the shorter range missiles. So we said that, look, both countries seem to have not absorbed the real lesson of the sinking of the Elath in 40 years ago this month. And especially the U.S. Navy did not. And this was something that was not academic to me, because during the 73 war, the ship I commanded was dispatched to the Indian Ocean to sit off of Socotra Island in case there was a need for American intervention. As I passed through the Straits of Malacca, I happened to overtake a deployment of Russian submarines, all of which were cruise missile launching submarines. And like any good ship captain, a lovely day, and in the Straits of Malacca, international law requires that combatant submarines be on the surface. I looked at them, got out the intelligence books, saw what they had, and then compared to what I had to defend against it, and I was very unhappy. We really had not taken that as seriously as we should. Over the intervening years, the U.S. Navy has done much better on the subject, but at that time, we did not. It's not clear the Israeli Navy has done all that it could do in terms of its battle with technology on this subject. So when I make the comments I make today, please understand I'm making these about the American system because I'm not qualified to advise the state of Israel. But I think I am qualified to make some points which may generate some discussion, some debate. As always, David Avery is smarter than I am and has covered some of the same points and done particularly well at them. But from my point of view, between the time Ze'ev and I spoke and now, certain things have happened that should have made this more serious. In 1987, the Iraqis attacked the USS Stark in May, killed 37 American sailors. I was very disappointed in how the American government reacted to that. I would have thought we would have been rather upset. Instead, we assumed that it was a mistake on the part of the Iraqi pilot and that Saddam Hussein, in his inevitable fashion, would take care of this guy. Well, it turns out a few years later, the guy was doing fine. He had no problem, had a nice, healthy career. So we were quite wrong about that. Certainly, the Scud missile attacks in Israel during the 1991 war, without any provocation, should have made people more and more conscious that this was the type of a system that would be turned to by a number of rogue states. Over the years, there have been various shots of Katyushas into Israel. But the Americans suffered 28 killed American soldiers in the missile attack on the barracks at Tehran in 1991. So we were facing the problem too. And then in 2003, it wasn't widely reported, but there were something like 6 cruise missiles fired against Kuwait as we were invading Iraq. They were very crude. They were versions of the Silkworm. They were not particularly well guided. But you may remember one evening on television when they talked about a shopping center being attacked and the destruction of the shopping center. What people didn't realize is that the missile missed it, landed about 200 yards away. But it was such a large warhead that the overpressure is what damaged the shopping center. And then last year's attack against Israeli naval vessels with some very thoughtful modern technology, wherein the Israeli Navy faced the situation of getting near a coast and an opponent being able to fire something and guide it optically for a long way until finally turning over to a shortwave radar, brought home the fact that notion of literal warfare and fighting in close to the beach is going to be especially difficult over time. So as all of these things unfolded over the years, what happened? Well, the SDIO program in the United States languished. It became a political issue, and I'll touch on that in a second. The U.S. Navy did get very serious about cruise missile defense, and in some cases fielded systems which once they fielded them, they realized they had to never use them, because in one particular case, the system that was fielded turned out to be something that attracted missiles as compared to deflecting missiles. But they made sure that every ship took off its cooling pump for that system and mailed it in inventory so they could never turn it on. And that became a wonderful place to store bicycles, physical fitness equipment, and things like that, but you never wanted to use the system. The Israeli Arrow program proceeded, and certainly the United States was very supportive of it, and I was very supportive of it. And there's been various R&D efforts. Until recently, the United States was very disorganized on this subject. And for instance, when in the case of Thiel, the tactical high-energy laser system that Avi worked on and that David spoke of, it was a jointly funded program. The Americans started funding it less and less, and the Israelis, for reasons that you would know better than I, chose not to really do very much with it. When this administration came into office, it realized that the situation had changed, that there was a state like North Korea who might, in fact, try to fire a missile, potentially with a nuclear warhead, either against U.S. forces or major U.S. allies, and eventually at the United States itself. And I think they caught everyone's attention when they fired a ballistic missile over Japan, which meant they were looking for range. They're looking for considerable range. And it was not the type of regime that fell into the normal state-to-state relations where you, in fact, worry about how best to deter an opponent, and it isn't always necessary to attack that opponent. There's lots of other things you can do. In the case of North Korea, we felt here was a serious problem that was not amenable to the usual solutions, and so the Missile Defense Agency was created. Now, its history is yet to be written. It has gotten great support during this Bush administration. We don't know what will happen to it now that the Congress is a Democratic Congress. The next president may find himself or herself facing a terrific battle with the Congress over whether to continue this, because there's this major political dimension with respect to missile defenses. So when you start to think, well, why was there so little response with all of this evidence? Why did we do this? And the point I used to make to people was that, look, I don't think this is a technology problem. There's really more going on here. I said, for instance, let's assume that a state like Iran or a state like North Korea developed a phenomenal way to shoot down American airplanes. Well, as David would know, and General Wagner would know, the United States Air Force would create its own Manhattan Project, and we would get at that problem and make sure that could not happen. But yet, we didn't respond in a similar way to missiles. Why? To me, it's fascinating. Neither the United States nor Israel ever created a rocket force. Soviet Union did. Soviet Union had people who really worried about how to use rockets. They also had a separate air defense force. In the case of the United States, offensive counter-air and things like that, it's an Air Force mission. Defensive airfields was an Army mission. And it's only in the Iraqi conflict where the Army has said, we don't have enough troops, and it's all yours, and have walked off. So now the Air Force is in the business of having to defend its own bases, which is something relatively new. But no one service had the responsibility to worry about missile defense. And the reason the ships were protected is because there was one service who worried about that, the United States Navy. And as they looked at this and took it more seriously and studied the Russians, they found that the Russians recognized that there was absolute vulnerabilities to U.S. ships and that cruise missiles were the best way to get them. Some of you may remember a system called the SSNX-13. It was a Russian ballistic missile aimed against ships. But the Russians soon learned that it's terribly difficult to get a moving object when you're coming down at very high speeds. and that it's easy for ships to mask where they really are, and so they abandoned the project after trying to develop it. So no one service was in charge. Secondly, we had in the United States what I call a group of the talking heads, or arms control theologians, or geniuses from think tanks, and I apologize to any colleagues here who are in think tanks, who argue that, look, you just don't have to worry about these things. After all, they haven't killed that many people. And the cost to defend against them is going to be so high, the cost per life saved is so outrageous that there's no reason to do very much. And so that was one argument. And other people argued, well, look, these things aren't really worth very much because they could be easily overwhelmed. And if they're easily overwhelmed, then again, it makes no sense to try and build a lot. But what was going on was the fact that they always were thinking in what I call catch-or-mitt terms. In other words, wait for the missile to come to you, and at the last second, shoot it down, kill it, deflect it, do something else. So their thinking was that way because in the SDIO debates, the notion of a space-based attack system, which would be attacking missiles that were exo-atmospheric, generated an enormous debate, had the Russians absolutely frightened because we were talking about warfare in space. Now, interestingly enough, if you let the clock go forward, there's been warfare in space. Don't kid yourself. And the Russians were the first to be up there with it, and I think you noticed that the Chinese had no qualms whatsoever to demonstrate that they could do some interesting things in space by blowing up one of their own satellites and filling an already congested zone with a lot more junk. So this was an issue where the talking heads and people thought of it in a way that was strange. Then if you showed that you had something that might work, then the second part of the argument took over, which was, oh my gosh, if this thing works, it's destabilizing. Because we were relying on a mutual assured destruction philosophy, which was, look, if you hit us, we'll hit you so badly that we'll both go up in flames, all our people will glow in the dark. To many rational people, it was an insane notion, but there were those who said it's the basis for deterrence. Now, if either state developed truly effective anti-missile systems, then the destabilization came about because mutual assured destruction only applied to one side, not to the other side. And that's why the Russians objected as much as they did. That's why the INF Treaty came about. And it underlies, in my opinion, why President Putin is so dead set against the deployment of even the very modest system that we're deploying in the United States to Poland or Czech Republic, because of the same underlying concern that the Americans may be in a position at some point where they can handle a missile attack, whereas the Russians or others could not. So therefore, this subject, with no one really taking the lead, a lot of talking heads against it, an arms-controlled community that believed that this was an inherently destabilizing system, and led us to such things as the INF Treaty, where if Israel chose to, it could build a missile of the range of a Scud. The United States is prohibited by treaty. We cannot build such a missile. We cannot build anything that flies further than 500 kilometers, but less than 5,500 kilometers. So we build short-range things and we build very long-range things, but we cannot respond. But there's no great clamor to do so because, to the Americans, cruise missiles are really an effective system. And we've been using land attack offensive cruise missiles now for years. And you recall the systems that are being used are conventional versions of the nuclear Tomahawk. And they are quite effective. They do take some time to come in. And that brings us to a point later on of saying when you go to respond, the response time is very slow. But you now have, for instance, certain people thinking that we ought to take some of our long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, fit them with conventional warheads, find some way to be able to communicate to the Russians that if they're launched from this certain area of the United States, that they're conventional, in order to have something that's a very quick response. So we have a fledgling modest system that we're deploying at this time in the case of ballistic missiles, and there is a great advantage to defending against ballistic missiles. They typically follow Newtonian physics. They follow a parabolic arch. Cruise missiles, on the other hand, have gotten to the point where an opponent can choose the altitude, can choose the radial, they fly very low, and they're extraordinarily difficult to detect. Ballistic missiles are very hard to detect, very difficult to shoot down. A cruise missile is easy to shoot down, but unbelievably hard to detect, and if they get stealthy, things get even worse. So my sense that this subject has not been taken as serious as it should, either by the Americans or by Israel, comes about not because of technology at all. It comes about because of political will and trade-offs between money spent here and money spent elsewhere. So in many respects, we've been self-deterred from doing what we really ought to do. And our military bureaucracies, in the case of the United States, and the talking heads have invariably pushed us back to trying to catch them as they come down. But I think that hurts us. So my own sense is, if we're going to think about this issue, we are going to have to think about defense in depth in a much more elaborate and constructive way. And here, I may stir up controversy, but I'm just trying to pose sets of questions. If you recognize that missile defense encompasses the building, the storage, the transportation, the launches, and the launch, and the missile coming down, and that that's the missile's life, then you ought to think about where along that path should you intervene at various times. I agree with David's point that it may be difficult to use preemption, but I think David was talking about a specific type of preemption. I, for instance, believe that if hostilities are imminent and all of a sudden long-range missiles are erected on a pad, my sense is that's a red line. Get them, attack them. And I found it particularly interesting that during the Korean discussions, when the Koreans, in fact, were about to test another long-range missile, that some of the leading thinkers of the Democratic Party came out and said, if it's erected, shoot it now. Teach the North Koreans that we will get it as soon as it comes up. So to the mind of some of these leading people who we may just see back in government again in a year and a half, their red line was very different than somebody else's red line. We have to think, what are appropriate red lines? And we have to have that debate. At what point is it really preemption as we thought of it before, or what point is it just sensible things? Any good Air Force officer knows that you don't have to wait for a surface air-to-air missile to be in the air before you attack it. You know, SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, say, get them on the ground. Any good Air Force officer knows that the best way to defeat an enemy Air Force is to blow it up on its own base. So offensive counter-air is inherent to it. And I think the Israeli Air Force demonstrated that quite effectively in the 1967 war. Right? Okay, so you have to think of this broadly, and you have to worry about what are the concepts of operations an opponent's going to use, what sort of doctrine, how do they control all of this, and in fact move increasingly to getting an understanding of what is the intelligence preparation of the battlefield for this subject. Those who are either in IDF or have been, or in the Israeli Air Force, understand this concept of the intelligence preparation of the battlefield. You have to know a lot, and the more you know, the better off you'll be when you have to either defend or attack. You have to know capabilities, you have to know how people think, and what sort of doctrines are involved. In this case, I, for years, have agreed with another friend who passed away this year, Kobe Torin, who had some very interesting thoughts about boost phase intercept. And so Kobe and I discussed this over a number of year period. I'm a believer in it. And I think we're going to have to return to that kind of thinking. That, yes, we may want to be a bit careful, but why do we wait for the darn missile to be over our territory, over our troops, when we can possibly say, look, it can't get launched before we kill it? And if you follow closely what's happening in the Missile Defense Agency, the Navy Aegis system is being modified to do boost phase intercept, to have a hot missile that catches something goes up. And by the way, the Soviets for years spent a lot of money on trying to have a very hot surface-to-air missile system that could catch ballistic missiles as it started out. So we have to think of a broad concept of operations. We have to think of defense in depth as more than just catching these missiles. We have to recognize that cruise missiles are a unique type of animal. And while we haven't seen many of them yet, I note that Pakistan has just tested its first homemade, home-designed, or at least we think home-designed, land attack cruise missile. These things have great advantages. We knew, for instance, as soon as we saw the Israeli Navy ships hit, that what was being applied was a version of what the U.S. Navy faced if it ever tried to get up to the White Sea. The Soviet Union had made sure that that area was loaded, which at the time were SSN-3s on the back of trucks that were hidden and taken out to a pre-surveyed site to get a surface ship and to make sure that it was very uncomfortable for the U.S. Navy to come up. So we saw a repeat of history going on. And I think we have to now start to think of what are the advantages to an opponent of cruise missiles. Well, David discussed chemical warheads. Let me tell you, the best delivery system for chemical or biological weapons is a cruise missile, because you can set it just wherever you want it to go, above the wind. You can set it at the altitude that's optimal. It's very hard to do that with a ballistic missile. It's very easy with a cruise missile. And you can, in the case of something that's aerosol, you can spray it over a path. Not that I know that anyone's going to do this, it's just that I think that the history is unfolding in such a way that these enemies of both of us are increasingly going to do that. Secondly, we've learned that when you start to deal with these defenses, you have to get away from the mentality of a point defense, because no one system sitting by itself is going to do it. It requires an integrated defense. It requires what the Navy developed as cooperative engagement. Because quite often you're taking a snippet of information here, a bit of information here, and you're putting together a mosaic, and it's from the mosaic that you have to act. I still don't think we're very serious about that in my own country, because we have a command and control system for airplanes. We have a command and control system now for missile defense. Yet, if you go to a cruise missile, you're between the typical ballistic missile and the typical airplane, and you have a very complicated airspace, which is going to require some exquisite coordination, rapid decision-making, very great intelligence preparation on the battlefield. And as the cruise missiles get stealthier, and they will, it becomes yet even more difficult to use just land-based radars that look up, that have to face the radar equation and face the curvature of the Earth. More is going to have to be done from the air, from national technical means overhead. So let me pull this all together then. I believe, in the case of both of our countries, that we will harm future generations if we do not move more deliberately to field missile defenses against both ballistic and cruise missiles. Now, missile defenses don't have to be perfect. This is a great subject for 80% solutions. You get something out there, and then you do a continuous process improvement. And I've seen that happen in both offensive and defensive systems on board ships. Secondly, such defenses can be very expensive, especially if all you think about is the catcher mitts, because they get very, very expensive. A broad notion will require a lot of political dialogue. What are appropriate red lines? What's an appropriate concept of operations to deal with these threats? And you can't just stop the budget for everything else and shift the money to this. But what you can do is to have a strategy and a consistent funding stream and allow bright people who you put in charge of this problem to deal with it. So Bodiger thinks the Israeli Air Force should be in charge. I have no comment. I do observe that the Missile Defense Agency has been headed by 2 Air Force generals, and it's had great success, and the Army has been quite willing to accept this to a point, but I don't know what's going to happen in the future. But it sure helps if there is some, as we say, some belly button, and it's his or her problem to worry about this, and that person has the ability to argue for budget and to be able to tell others that, look, there's trade-offs that need to be made. Because we're not talking about trading off something that's bad to something that's good. We're talking about trade-offs between dealing with 2 things that are both good for the nation to do. It's the subject we have in common. I have done everything I possibly can and will continue as a failed retired person to make sure that Israel and the United States works together on this, because as 2 democracies, this is a tough issue to sell. Amos Yaron knows better than any of us in the room. And it's a tough issue to get armed forces to say, I will do with 1 less fill in the blank, ship, airplane, tank, in order to have this system, unless they're held responsible. So I wish both of our nations the very best in getting on with this problem. Thank you, sir.
I think we're running over time, so maybe if there's just one question, that's probably all we have time for at the most. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming to Israel and to address this convention, Dr. Rauch. And I'd like to ask you a simple question. What can this organization help how can we help create a change in both US and IS in terms of doing something in order to make it happen? I'm talking about missile defense in both sides of the ocean, on both sides of the ocean. How can we facilitate?
Thank you for the softball question. I could have been hit a lot harder. That's one where I think by having people who are credible argue the case and make the case and try to influence both the legislative bodies of both countries to take action before things are bad. You know, it's a classic problem of democracies that it's hard for us to act early when it's not a compelling situation. We usually have to wait until something bad happens when it's compelling, but now it's much more expensive and much harder to deal with. The trouble with these sorts of things is the lead time to have an effective system in place is probably 15 years. And so if you don't start, you have a problem. And I just found that, especially as secretary, if I could get a consistent budget, if I could make sure that I could think 3 years from now we'd have X amount of dollars for whatever it was, you can plan, you can make things happen. It's amazing how all the engineers settle down. It's amazing how all the subcontractors settle down because there's some predictability from their point of view of jobs and as a company, and there's predictability in the service that says we don't have to try and do everything at once. We don't have to try and make a case that scares people. We can work at this little by little, and you do that. And you find at certain points where you go and you feel certain things, and then you improve those, and you're liable to find something better, fine. Put the better thing out there. But consistency, it's a case that has to be made by organizations like this one. And so I particularly was willing to work with Avi in this because there's going to be a conference in Washington in December, and we're going to have just the mirror image of what we have here, except the people there will be thinking in terms of intercontinental. We'll have to point out to them, no, look, it's been cruise missiles and it's IRBMs that have killed Americans. No intercontinental missile has killed any Americans. But IRBMs have, and cruise missiles have, and this is not a trivial subject, but it's only going to get worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. That brings us to the next break. Thank you very much. 2 o'clock. We will begin again at 2 o'clock. Shah Stein.